Okay, so it's my pleasure to welcome everybody to this RDA interest group called Federated Identity Management. The aim of the session today and the title of the session is Protecting Access to Your Research Data. I am doing the invitation just because Hannah asked me to do this. I mean, Hannah and Carlo are actually the co-chairs of the interest group, but I'm one of the coordinators of the FIM4R working group, the FIM4R collaboration that we have, that I'll say a few words about in a moment. And it was just to enable Hannah not to talk the whole time. So I think in terms of introduction, you've probably heard this in other sessions. Speakers, unless you're speaking, you're asked to mute and switch off your cameras. There is a shared scribing document, which I'll send now to the chat window. If you want to ask questions in there or make comments, please do. There's a table at the beginning to actually write down your name and email address if you're here, so that we can contact you afterwards. And we encourage you to join the RDA interest group, the Federated Identity Management, and also consider joining the FIM4R community as well. So just a couple of words of introduction. So welcome to the group. This is all about protecting data. It's all about access control. So this is Federated Authentication and Authorization. It builds on the work that we did in the EU-funded project, AARC, Authentication and Authorization for Research and Collaboration. And that work is being taken forward by the GÉANT 4-3 project and other collaborating entities. So thank you for joining. The aims today are to begin to dissect how our research communities can use assurance. Now, assurance is one of those important aspects of authentication. What is the quality of the identity proofing? What's the quality of the authentication credential, etc.? And Hannah will tell us more about that. And then we're going to have two talks. One looking about the best practices for protecting research collaborations coming out of the work of the ARC project, and then learning about the EOS strategy for protecting multiple research collaborations and infrastructures, the two aspects. And then there'll be some time for some discussion. So next slide, please, Hannah. So the agenda, we will soon move on to Hannah, who's going to tell us all about assurance, protecting research communities. Nikolai is going to tell us about that from the ARC guidelines, etc. And then Christos is going to tell us about protecting shared infrastructure from the point of view of the European Open Science Cloud and the authentication and authorization infrastructure work that's going on there. And then there'll be a little bit of time for closing questions at the end. But please do join the RDA interest group, do join the FIM4R community. So next slide, please, Hannah. So just a few slides on what is federated identity management. I imagine most people may know this, but just in case it's all rather new to you, the idea of a federation in the identity sense is that you have groups of service providers. These are the critical services that are provided to the federation for people to use, and the identity providers that's doing the authentication, so the IDPs and the SPs. And they're agreeing to operate under a set of policies and therefore belong to the federation. And in the picture here, you see all of the entities within this one circle shape, whatever you call it. Federations are typically established nationally, and in the past have been using the SAML2 protocol for information exchange, although the actual use of protocols and credentials is evolving now. And each entity within the federation is described by metadata, and the metadata gets shared out to all participants. So the next one, please, Hannah. So how do the different federations interact with people across the world? So EduGain is the interfederation that we use in the research and education space. This actually connects together all of the national federations. So here in the diagram, you see Federation A, B, and C. And those identity providers and service providers that have joined EduGain are in that EduGain cloud in the middle there. And Edugain then bundles all of the metadata together and publishes it into a central location so services can find the identity providers, etc. And then next slide. So the final bit here is, how do we, the research communities and our research data, join into all of this? We can't necessarily all join one of these federations. If we can, then that's fairly simple. But on the left here is a orangey browny colored entity, the Research Project Federation, with SPs and IDPs in there, and we join into Edugain via this proxy. This was an important standardization that came out of the ARC project and being used by many of the research communities. So from outside, from Edugain, that proxy just looks like a service. So the whole of the research community is represented in the Edugain Federation by a single service provider. But from inside the Research Project Federation, it looks like an identity provider. The proxy then gives access to all of the identity providers around the interfederated world called Edugain. And we depend on the stability of Edugain as the authentication infrastructure. Next slide. So who else is active in FIM? Well, clearly there's this interest group within RDA, which is important for getting to the research and data communities. The Research and Education's Federations group called RefEds is actually managing and coordinating and sharing best practices in the federation space. So that's the Federation and Edugain and the interspace there. The work that had been done by the ARC project is being taken forward by GN4-3, and the trusted identity activities within there are maintaining the output from ARC and taking that forward. And then, as I said, there is this FIM4R group, which was created now getting on for 10 years ago to represent research community needs. And we've written 2 papers to date, 2 white papers describing our requirements. And we give those papers to the technology providers, to the federations, to actually try to implement a common view of what the federated identity space should look like. And if you represent a research community which is not in that organization, then there's a link at the bottom right there to FIM4R, and there you will find the pointer to the version 2 paper. That would be interesting. But also contact through the RDA interest group is also, of course, very welcome. So I think at this point I'm going to pass over to Hannah, who's going to tell us all about the important topic of assurance in federated identity management.
Great. Thank you very much, Dave. Super. So if people have questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A, or you can add them to the Google Doc. If the slides aren't big enough, there's a little icon to expand the screen on the slides area, because we have an interactive quiz later. So you'll need to be able to either scan the content or then go to a web browser. So just a heads up for the future. So these slides, a few people, notably our colleague Eula, who can't be here. She's on holiday, lucky thing. So I cannot take all the credit. And what we're talking about here is the question of how sure can we be about a federated user's identity. So as a research community, I have somebody authenticating to my services from Edugain. How can I know anything about that user? How can I know how the registration and the identity proofing was done? Did the person have to show a passport? Did they have to go in person? Was there nothing like that? Maybe this is even a shared account, like a library user account for a university. And there are plenty of other questions that I could be asking as a security conscious research community operator. Can this same user ID be reassigned to somebody else in the future? Maybe that will determine how I design my services in terms of data privacy, particularly. Is the information I'm getting about the user accurate? Or could it have changed? If somebody changes their name, how quickly will that data be updated in the user information that I get when they authenticate to me? Will it be done instantly? Will it take a couple of days? Or will it maybe take a few months? And equally, if that user then leaves the research, leaves their university, how quickly will that account become invalidated? Another aspect of this is, how was the user authentication done? And the big question we have here was this just username and password, or was it also involving second factor authentication? By that we mean a multi-factor token that could come from a smartphone app, it could come from a hardware token, it could be your fingerprint scanner on your laptop. So those are the questions that we're trying to answer. And assurance is the framework that tries to describe the degree of confidence that a digital identity really belongs to the expected entity or user. And when we break it down a little more formally, we've got several different aspects to this. I'm getting a warning that my Wi-Fi is not very good, so hopefully it's okay. Sorry if I break up. We've got the reliability of identifiers. Do they change? Will they change in the future? Are they unique? Can they be reassigned? We've got ID proofing. Was an ID check done? How was it done? How reliable is that information? We have the attributes. So are they accurate? What can we expect in terms of freshness? And then we have the authentication assurance. So was multi-factor authentication. And by 2FA, I'm using 2FA and MFA in parallel, really. Thanks for the comment. So service providers may choose to trust users based on the assurance information that's issued by their identity provider. So for example, we know that the NIH is planning to require certain aspects of assurance for researchers to be able to access their online platforms. And there are various other research communities who do require a certain level of assurance. But at the moment, the adoption of this reliance on external assurance is fairly low. And this is something that we'll be discussing. The other option is for research communities to boost assurance of their incoming users by, for example, performing ID proofing themselves. So I realized I forgot to introduce myself. My name's Hannah. I work at CERN on the identity management systems. And one of the things that we do is to do identity proofing of the users locally. So that's how we approach this problem, or part of the problem, as we will see. There's quite a lot of ongoing work around assurance. I don't want to go into it in too much detail, but just so that people are aware that you don't have to start from scratch if this is something that you're considering for your research community or a problem that you're just beginning to think about. As I said, it's likely that some research communities may start requiring a certain level of assurance, notably the NIH. So research communities that have particularly private data, like health data in this case, that may be something where that research community can benefit from assurance from Edugain and from identity federations. There are already several assurance profiles that define specific levels of trustworthiness. So you don't need to reinvent the wheel. You can use what's already there. But so far, very few identity providers support these profiles. And it's kind of a chicken and egg scenario. They're missing these driving use cases. But without identity providers supporting assurance, very few services are willing to rely on it. As research communities, and this is something that Dave mentioned earlier, we might be able to pool our voices together and then be able to influence the uptake of such profiles. And concretely, this could be a short white paper authored by the FIM for our community. And one of the aims of today is to see what you as RDA people think about the direction that assurance should be taking in the wider community. Did I skip one? No. So just to give you an example of an assurance profile so that it's something concrete, this is the REFEDS assurance profile. It's a component-based approach, and it's been slightly simplified to have two kind of compact assurance profiles. One is espresso for high assurance, and one is cappuccino. There always seem to be names given to the different qualifying levels of these assurance profiles. So for example, if I have a user who conforms to the cappuccino level, so the low assurance level profile, I can know that the ID of that user is unique, personal, and traceable, that the ID proofing was done at least at a medium level, so that's postal credential delivery. And there are lots more documents that go into some detail about what this actually means. I can expect the attributes to be accurate for a month, and the user has used single-factor authentication. And then the other option is the espresso one, where again, the ID is unique, personal, and traceable. There's been high ID proofing, so face-to-face identity vetting. Again, the attribute freshness is 1 month, and multi-factor authentication was used in this case. But since it's done in components, you may pick and choose which particular aspects of the assurance profile are important for your research community. And the idea is to make it really modular. So at this point, I would like everybody to get their phones or a browser ready, because we have a little quiz where I'm hoping to gather input from all of you as a start on the direction that we as a community would like these assurance profiles to be making. So hopefully some of you have used Slido already. All you need to do is use your phone to scan the QR code, or go to the browser, slido.com, and enter that 6-digit code at the bottom. I'll do it as well just to check it's working. And then please answer the question, and hopefully we'll see some answers popping onto the screen in a minute. I'll give you a couple of minutes since this is a wordy question as well to kick us off. Okay, so far, lots of yeses. So Beverly can't see the number. Thank you, Magdalena. Yeah, the Slido number is 649810. We'll give it a few more minutes so that people can make sure they're in. So we had one no, and we have quite a lot of other comments. I'd want to know more about it first, but generally yes. But can I trust it? One no. If the person who put a no, or if anybody else puts a no, if you could put another comment in the chat or in the doc, that would be great, so we have a little bit more background. But we can also come back to this in the discussion later. All right, thank you. So we have 14 answers. I'm not sure quite how many people we have in the call. I see a few more coming in. Yes, it might even be better. Okay, let's move on to the next question, and hopefully we'll see the numbers increasing as we go. So this is, how do you handle identity proofing for your researchers at the moment? And we have options. We don't do it at all. We do it ourselves. We rely on local branches or subunits of the research community to do it, or we outsource it to an external company or body. So most people are doing some kind of identity vetting. It's already interesting to see that that's already obviously something that people care about. Thank you, Jessica, for saying there's about 28 people. That's super. A few people have outsourced it. I'd be interested to hear what kind of companies or bodies do that outsourced identity proofing as well. Again, something for the chat later. So we're up to 13. We might be missing a few more answers. We had 15 in the last one. Thanks, by the way, for getting involved in this. This is genuinely going to be useful for getting started with trying to pull together a cohesive idea of what we as research communities would like to see. Okay, let's move on to the next one. Who would you be willing to trust to perform the identity vetting? Universities, governments, banks, post offices, or other? This is assuming that there's some kind of really externalized identity vetting. And I'm aware that it's very cultural. So in some countries, post offices do a lot of this kind of thing, and in other countries, they don't at all. So that's quite an interesting one. For the people who pick other, it would be great if you could add in the notes or the chat what that other looks like. And again, we can come back to discussion. All right, up to 14 people. Pretty good. Great, thanks. Okay, so we have a comment from Oliver. Other for me would be a system like Shibboleth in the UK. So I imagine because Shibboleth is a software, there would probably be some organization that's operating it that would do the identity vetting. Interesting that other would maybe be solicitors as well. Carlo, maybe we come back to your question in a little bit. I think I have maybe 2 more questions on the quiz, and then we can have a good old discussion. So switching topics slightly onto multi-factor authentication, and do your researchers use second factor authentication or multi-factor authentication to access your services? And the options we put were no, yes, we provision users with second factor for our services, or yes, but we rely on outsourced second factor authentication. So maybe using Google second factor authentication. Okay, great. It would be interesting to hear who those outsourcing bodies are as well. Almost there. 13. Okay. And this is the final question that we had. What would help you, do you think, to trust an assertion of second factor authentication from an identity provider in Edugain? So again, an identity provider in Edugain is probably some other university whose users would be accessing your research community. So if anybody does have some certification, use of a common second factor authentication provider, interesting. Yeah, I could imagine a nice future where there is some available second factor authentication token provisioner for everyone. Okay, again, if it's not a commercial provider like Facebook or Google, but maybe something that's trusted by our community, that's part of the research and education space. I imagine some people might not have anything to put in this one, so we won't leave it open for too long. What, 7? Following the guidelines of the Federation, yeah, which is not always the case, unfortunately, for people who are deeply embedded within this identity federation space. Encryption, nice. Standards, once it has a lot of users. Great, thank you. That's all very, very helpful. Okay, so I'll leave that one up in case you have some more thoughts as we're going along. So the next part of the session is to have a bit of an open discussion until 40 minutes past, I think. So we have 15 minutes. So I wanted to follow up on a question that Carlo had. Carlo, do you want to say your question? And in fact, if anybody would like to unmute their camera and join the discussion, that'd be great.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah.
So my question was about the Federation of Identity, because my institute is in the EduGain Federation, and normally I'm supposed to join the EOSC services using my institute credential, but actually it was not working, and we passed almost a month trying to debug the reason, and we were in a blocking point where EOSC people, EOSC service were expecting a certain level of information as a profile, and our institute won't agree to send them those information because it was protected by the GDPR. So we are still blocked at this level because EOSC is asking questions that my institute legally cannot send. So I was wondering if these coffee-like profile in refeeds are GDPR compliant or not.
It's a slightly different problem, and they have intentionally not been overlapped. So the GDPR problem is a big one. I'm not sure which profiles EOSC requires. Nicola, do you know?
If you can answer, yes. So currently, the EOSC profile conforms to the REFEDS, the Research and Education mandatory profile. So it's information, name, a persistent user identifier, email, and affiliation of the user if this is available. So affiliation is not mandatory. So it's strictly the mandatory attribute bundle from the Research and Education Network.
But Carlo, were you saying that EOSC doesn't seem to comply with the GDPR regulation?
Actually, my identity provider explained to me that he cannot send those information according to the GDPR, and they explained me that these information are not compliant with this legal framework.
I think maybe we should follow up offline, and we could talk with Renata as well, because I guess you're part de Renata, being in France.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. If you could ping me an email, and hopefully we can get this sorted. Yeah, so this is kind of one of the big problems with Identity Federation, is that all these thousands of institutes that are in it don't necessarily trust each other. So this example from Carlo, that the identity provider is unwilling to release a very basic set of attributes to EOSC, which is a well-known service that's supported by the European Commission, that kind of highlights some of the breakdowns in the trust fabric of it at the moment, and it's something that lots of people are working really hard to address. So we had some input in the chat. So particularly, who would you be willing to trust to perform identity vetting? Solicitors is a nice one. And then Jessica was saying that SURF in the Netherlands. So some of you will be really lucky that you're part of identity federations that offer this on a national level. And I think SURF is one of those. So that's quite nice. And maybe something that as research communities, we want to encourage this kind of behavior. Maybe that's a trustworthy way of boosting the assurance of our users. And again, that was also relevant to the outsourcing question. Does anybody have a question based on what we've been discussing so far? Lars, you want to say your comment out loud? I mean, I agree with you that identity provision is typically sensitive personal data. But one of the examples that people like to say is that actually the necessary information that would be sent between an identity provider and a service is no more than you would get in an email. You'd get the person's name, you'd get their email, effectively that's it. The only additional information that is often required in EduGain is the affiliation of somebody. So that can be whether they're a student or faculty or a member of an organization that runs an identity provider. So it is sensitive data, but the community has, when I say the community, I mean sort of the RefEds community. People operating in this space are pretty willing to accept that they're not going to get any more confidential information than name and email and a persistent identifier. So we're going for a low baseline of the data that's sent around. For the people who said that they would not consider trusting external assurance at all for their researchers, could I ask anybody to give an opinion as to why? Either on the chat or just unmute yourselves and join me in the video. Okay. No one particularly willing. Or maybe people changed their minds as we went through and talked about it a little bit more. So maybe I can give you a bit of context about how we're thinking about this at CERN. So at the moment, we provision our own multi-factor tokens for our own users. And at the moment, the infrastructure, thanks, Lars. At the moment, all the critical infrastructure is only really available to people with CERN accounts. But we're hoping that in the future, we won't have to give CERN accounts to everybody. And we'll be actually able to rely on this on Identity Federation. We already can a little bit, but not for critical services, not for physics workflows, for example. But eventually we'd like to get to the stage where we can trust a user coming in through Edugain, and we can know that they had their identity vetted and that their attributes will be kept up to date. And ideally, we'd like to rely on an assertion of multi-factor authentication as well externally, since this would decrease the overhead on our side and would allow people to really use their organizational identities as they're kind of designed in the system, that everybody just has one identity and they can use it for all the research they do, whichever research community that might be. So if there are no more questions, I'll just check with Dave or Nicholas or Christos. Do you have anything you want to add at this point? Or have we lost everybody? I see people pinging in and out of the chat.
Okay. I have managed. I was having terrible trouble getting my camera back on. I just wanted to say something a little bit about the GDPR issue. I mean, this is clearly a big issue, and we had hoped one of the aspects of the GDPR is the ability for a community of like cases to create a code of conduct. And we had been working, I mean, RefEds and the whole community had been working with lawyers, and a lot of work had gone into creating a draft code of conduct, which we were hoping to submit for approval to the data protection authorities. And then part of the problem was that the data protection authorities have not yet produced guidance on how to apply such a code of conduct to international outside of the EU. By that I mean transfers. And of course, for global research, we need to be able to transfer not just within the EU, but outside as well. And so now it's only recently been decided that we're no longer going to actually submit a code of conduct for approval. This is a great shame, because if we'd had that approved, that would have been the way by which it would have been legal for SPs to ask for the attributes to be released by the IDPs, as long as the SP agrees that they will abide by the code of conduct. So now what's happening is the document will be changed into a sort of best practice document, and we're still hoping that we can actually do things in a way that they're not terribly sensitive pieces of personal information. It's just the name and the email address and the institute and an identifier. And one of the things about research in general is that people write academic journal papers with their name and their institute, and then they publish it, right? So this is not a secret. I know there are some research communities that don't do that, but in general, for a lot of it, it is, it's not highly sensitive. So we still have to work out exactly how to do that, but we need to actually make IDPs confident that we're managing this and managing the risks, and it is all about risk management. The only way of doing it fully legally would be to have bilateral contracts between every SP and every IDP, and there'd be millions of them, and the lawyers would never agree on the contracts, right? So that's a non-starter. So it is a big issue, but everybody's aware of it, and we're trying to enable it. Yes, Carla. We can't hear you. You're muted somewhere.
Okay, I have a complement of information about the problem I just mentioned. Actually, it was a side effect of the legal aspect based on metadata. Let me explain. Actually, my institute may send, according to GDPR, only the required metadata. And in EduGain, the given name, SN, and mail was declared as optional. So if they were declared in EduGain as required, my institute may send this information. But since they were declared as optional, according to the law, my institute cannot send this information. So it is basic metadata issues. All the information are there, but they cannot flow because of this legal restriction. So my institute asked to EduGain just to switch the declaration of this field, putting them required. They did not do that, so my institute still not sent this information.
Okay.
I think
that's a very interesting point we should follow up on.
Yeah. It's also a problem with the way this attribute requirements works as well, that it's largely not respected, but clearly legal issues.
So Hannah, I don't know, just before we hand over to Nicola, I mean, the idea of the FIM for our group writing a white paper on requirements for assurance, I mean, does anybody in the meeting today have an opinion about that? Would they like to do they think it's useful? Would they like to join in that activity? You can also tell us offline afterwards as well. But
we have quite a few people who have put their names in the doc to be added to the mailing list. So that's great. We can do that later.
I mean, our experience in the past is that by documenting common requirements and passing them on, that we do stand a slightly better chance of getting them deployed. I mean, as Hannah described, it is a chicken and egg situation. And if the IDPs are not willing to assert the assurance level, then we can't use it. And so it would be nice if we could actually say what sort of things we need to do. For example, if we're going to use multi-factor, do we have a common view of how we would like to see that done? Might be worth trying to write up, right? Anyway, sorry, Hannah, back to you.
No, it's fine. I was just, there's been quite a few interesting comments in the chat, actually. So there was a comment from Oliver saying, my knowledge of him is rather shallow, but is the idea of an authentication system precisely to not pass on personal information to third parties, but only to give a proof of identity? So by proof of identity, I assume you mean just a token saying, yes, this person authenticated with no personal information. And the problem with this is that most services can't really operate with just a yes, somebody authenticated. They need to know at least an identifier that says this is the same person the next time they come back. And they would normally have to request information directly from the user, like the name and email for contact purposes, which in the end doesn't protect the user at all. And there's a lot of value in getting verified data from trusted identity providers in EduGain, so getting it from universities or other institutes, rather than having a completely open, like a guest sign-up form from for any old website. There are some sites that operate on this successful authentication only concept. So some of the student discount sites for example, where they just need to know that somebody signed in and was a student, but they don't need to know their name, then yes. But is back to what Carla was hinting at with this required attributes and trying to only request what you need. And the idea is that research communities, we do genuinely need this information one way or another, and it's much better to get it directly from the university where the person is coming from. And we have a comment, I think, from Janos. Identity vetting is not very easy if identity federation is not hub and spoke type. Each IDP in the mesh type federation can decide individually to implement vetting. Yeah, okay, and in the hub and spoke federation, the federation operator can do much more of this. So in SURF, for example, I'm not sure which federation you're part of, but I think in SURF, the fact that they're hub and spoke means that they can offer these centralized second factor authentication systems, which is clearly an advantage. It's not necessary, but it does make it more simple. Adam, you've unmuted. Did you have a question?
Well, I'm just going to do the terrible conference thing of it's not a question, it's more an observation. Sorry, everyone. So I think, background, I used to do Shibboleth at a UK university. I'm now part of the team running the UK ORCID consortium. So I've got kind of my hand in some identity stuff and persistent personal details. And I think part of the kind of interest and tension here is about exactly what's just been talked about, the kind of necessary basic information that needs to be passed across. And that's always been something where with the OIDC and things like that, we could really, helpfully run single sign-on stuff, for example, against the ORCID registry if, it actually could be guaranteed to have full and complete information for everyone, which it doesn't. These kind of larger registries and needs for authentications are partly because we need to set up a way for people to be assured, see, I'm hitting the keywords, about how they have these identities stored, registered, and checked. And I think that some of the things that have been great about just listening to all these discussions is looking at these issues, because from a kind of open science and open research point of view, the provenance of the information is really important. Where stuff comes from and how we pass that around and pass it on for reuse and for taking data out of context, which is something that's increasingly happening, right? We're using it, we're creating it for one thing, and then it's being used somewhere else. And that reuse and repurposing is really helped and informed by having those provenance pieces in place. And that, again, we need to pass on that identity and that assurance from its original place to its original researchers. And to do that, we need to have all this framework and fabric for this federated identity management to pass it all through and to make sure it's all safe. And at the minute, like cross-reference stuff do this by having a metadata tab in the ORCID stuff where you can say auth equals true for the ORCID data, and it's just like, that's a bit of text that I can edit myself. And yes, so we kind of need to look at better ways of doing that. It would be great. So yeah, just kind of, throwing more stuff to the mix, not really necessarily being helpful, but
no, but that's great. Thank you. I tried to take some notes, but I think I missed some key points. If you could add anything into the shared doc, that would be great. I'll put the link again in the chat. Thank you, Adam. That was really interesting. Good to hear another perspective. So we are slightly behind time. Sorry, my fault. So at this point, we hand over to Nicholas.
Thank you, Hannah. Let me share my screen. Switch to presentation mode. Okay, so thanks to Hannah, I will not forget to self-introduce myself. So I'm Nicholas Liambotis. I work as a trust and identity engineer at GRNet, which is the Greek research and education network based in lockdown Athens. And in this session, I would like to discuss with you how the ARC blueprint architecture and the accompanying guidelines can help to research communities to manage access to the resources. This presentation will begin with an introduction to the ARC blueprint architecture. This will be followed by an overview of the different ARC guidelines, and there's at the end some links to further information that you can find for ARC and the guidelines. So regarding the ARC blueprint architecture, it all started 5 years ago, trying to address a key requirement. So we have researchers that need to access services and resources in a collaborative manner. We have individual researchers who, thanks to Edugain, can only use their institutional account to access the resources that are offered to the organization. But when, in the case of research collaboration, so when there are communities, we need a way for members to be able to access and share resources based on their roles in these research collaborations or communities. So to support this, the research collaborations need an authentication and authorization infrastructure that allows researchers to easily access all the resources they need. And towards this direction, ARC devised an approach to building such an architecture, and this is the ARC blueprint architecture, or BPA. So in the ARC blueprint architecture defines the key components for building an infrastructure in a scalable and secure way. The building blocks can be mixed and matched according to each research collaboration needs. So this gives the software architects the flexibility to build a customized solution tailored to their needs. The ARC is leveraging Edugain as a foundation for the federated identities, but adds the dimension of the research collaboration. So the existing relationship from the Identity Federation and Edugain between the user's home organization and the services that they try to access now becomes a relationship between the home organization, the collaboration, and the service. So the ARC architecture builds on Edugain and adds the required functionality to support common use cases, for example, access to non-web-based resources or authorized access based on group and role membership information. Here you can see the functional view of the ARC blueprint architecture, which is based on a proxy, which allows services to connect to a single point, which is the proxy, as also discussed by Dave in the introductory session. So the proxy is responsible for providing the connection between the identity providers and the services that need to be accessed by the research collaboration. So this reduces the need for each individual service to have to connect to Edugain, since the proxy acts as the single integration point. The first version of the ARC BPA was published back in 2016. Here you can see the latest revision, which provides a more detailed layered approach. But at the same time, it remains backwards compatible with the original ARC blueprint architecture. The different functional components are grouped into layers based on their functional roles. So let me kill my notifications, sorry for that. Yes, so starting from top to bottom, we have the purple layer, the user identity layer, which contains the services, the identity providers that allow researchers to use identities that can be used for joining the collaboration. Then there is the community attribute services layer, which is this bluish vertical layer here, which groups different components related to managing and providing information about the users, for example, the community group membership information, roles, which is added to the information that is provided by the upstream identity providers. Now, at the center of this architecture, there's this yellow access protocol translation layer, which contains some key services. I will start with the proxy, which serves as the single integration point between the identity providers and the end services from the end services layer. Then there is the discovery. Sorry. Then there is the token translation service, which is responsible for translating tokens using different technologies. Then there is the discovery service, which allows researchers to choose their authenticating provider. And lastly, there's the user notice component that is responsible for informing the user about the attributes that are going to be released to the various services that are made available to the collaboration. Now, there is also the authorization, this green vertical layer that is responsible for managing access, for controlling access to the connected services. One key point to highlight is that with this architecture, it is possible for the end services to delegate the complex authorization decisions centrally. So instead of each service having to separately deal with its authorization, it can offload the decision-making process to the central proxy-based AEI. And then there are the end services, which is the services that researchers need to access. As mentioned earlier, this can range from simple web-based services, portals, wikis, but this also includes non-web browser-based resources, for example, login cells, APIs, so not just things that users typically access from. Now, another interesting view of the same architecture is this version of the architecture you see on the right, which focuses on the interoperability, because there is an increasing number of use cases that requires researchers to access resources that are offered by by multiple infrastructures. So with this latest version of the ARC blueprint architecture, there's the concept of the community AEI, which streamlines access to the underlying resources. So the community AEI allows the researcher to use the institutional identity provider or any other provider that is allowed by its community, and they can access the services that are specific to the community, which we call community services. So these can need only to be connected to their community AI, but it is also possible for them to access generic services. The difference is that these generic services are offered to multiple communities. So typically these will be connected to multiple community AIs. Another interesting use case is when there are community services that require access to general purpose services that are offered by other infrastructures or research infrastructures. So in this case, the connection is usually mediated through what is called the infrastructure proxy. So the infrastructure proxy acts as the single integration point for the infrastructure services, and then the infrastructure proxy is connected to all the community AIs that they need to serve. Now moving on to the different guidelines, because the ARC is not just the architecture, but it is also there is also a set of guidelines that provide best practices for dealing with specific issues. Now there is a significant number of guidelines. So here we have grouped the guidelines according to the layer that they correspond. So starting with the user identity layer, there are guidelines that help answer key questions. For example, how to integrate social media identity providers, if this is allowed by the community. Then how users can link accounts and how this affects the assurance. Then there are also guidelines for managing multi-factor authentication. Now, more specific to assurance, there are best practices for evaluating the assurance from external identities. There are even more specific guidelines for evaluating the assurance specifically from social media accounts. Then again, how a deeper analysis of how the account linking impacts the evaluation of assurance, how the assurance information is going to be shared between different proxies, and given the different assurance frameworks and profiles, there is also a guideline document describing how these profiles are related to each other. Moving on to the access protocol translation layer, there are best practices for implementing token translation services and for translating federated identity information, for example, SAML assertions to X59 certificates, which are still used for accessing services. Specifically for the proxy component, which is part of the access protocol translation layer, there are guidelines for how the proxy can claim that it supports some best practices. Also, how to express the assurance information when interacting with another proxy. Also, how the discovery process can be simplified, and this is through a guideline that proposes an IDP hinting protocol. Then, regarding the community attribute services layer, there are best practices describing how to aggregate attributes from different attribute providers. A dedicated guidance document for expressing the home institute and the role of the user in that home institute, the affiliation information. Then best practices for running attribute authorities. There's also a baseline acceptable use policy that can be adopted by the research collaborations in order to facilitate interoperability. Then, related to authorization, how to manage authorization from multiple sources, how to express group and role information in a standard way that can be consumed by different infrastructures, and similarly, how to express source capability, so the actions that the researcher is allowed to perform on a given resource. Then, for end services, there are best practices for handling the credential delegation. There are services that need to act on behalf of a user. Then, how to handle access to non-web-based services. The hinting document that was already mentioned, but it also affects services, so this is why it is also listed here. How to simplify the discovery process by hinting the authenticating authority, the identity provider that the researcher should use. Then there are also guidelines about the security practices that need to be followed. Now, this is the number of guidelines that I just mentioned can be intimidated, but there is already there's a set of guidelines that is necessary for interoperability. So here in this list, and I've also included the link, you can see the number of guidelines, the list of guidelines that need to be adopted in order to enable interoperability between different proxies that follow the ARC blueprint architecture. And there is the AGES group, the ARC engagement group for infrastructures, that brings together the representatives from different research and infrastructures and AI operators in order to facilitate the adoption of the different best practices and guidelines. And lastly, related to a very important issue that implementers of the ARC-BP need to face. So regarding the policies, there's the policy development toolkit that is linked here, which provides a set of templates that the research collaboration can extend in order to develop its policies. So that was it. I know that this was a lot of information, so if you have any questions, I'll be happy to discuss them.
Anyone have any questions? I see lots of thumbs up, so that's very nice. Great. I guess it was clear. We'll put some helpful links in the Google Doc as well, so that people can find their way to the different guidelines. And we'll be uploading the slides to Zenodo as well.
Perfect.
Great. Thank you, Nicholas.
Thank you.
And our final speaker is Christos to talk about how identity will be handled in EOSC.
Hello, everyone. Let me try to share my screen. Okay. Screen. Can you see my screen now?
Not yet, sorry.
Okay, you can see my screen or not? Sorry.
No.
Not yet.
No. That's interesting. Again, let's try that.
If you can't make it work, you could send it to me and I can share the screen.
Yes, let's try once more. So I get an interesting error. I try to share and get an error saying failed to get access to your camera and microphone.
I had the same. I had to restart Chrome.
Okay,
Sorry.
so let me no, it's okay, let me send you the slides very quickly, or perhaps Nicholas, because I have you in the, I think it's faster if I send to you if that's convenient and okay with you, because I have you on Skype. I can yeah, sorry for this. Let me, that's always interesting.
A new platform, a new problem.
Yes. So, Nicholas, here you go. And I was about to say that everything went so smoothly.
Yeah. We did well. We got an hour of smooth session.
Yeah.
Not too bad.
So I'm sharing my screen now. PowerPoint, switch to presentation.
Yeah, we see it.
Perfect.
Thank you very much, Nicholas. So this last topic is about the authentication authorization topic in the context of the European Open Science Cloud. And because I saw a number of people who clearly are not from Europe, very briefly in one sentence, the European Open Science Cloud is an environment, an ecosystem for hosting and processing research data to support European science, right? The aim of European Open Science Cloud, EOSC, is to federate existing research data infrastructure across Europe and to realize a web of fair data and related services for science. So it's a very ambitious initiative that is being, of course, funded and supported by the European Commission through a number of projects. And of course, one important element in realizing this vision is how researchers can access resources and services. So 1 year ago, in the context of the EOSC Secretariat, a set of task forces were created, one of which was in the area of authentication authorization to investigate what needs to be done in order to enable this vision. And when we set up this task force, it was a bit more than a year ago, we set a vision that we aim to deliver a consistent architecture for authentication, authorization, and access control for the European Open Science Cloud. Next slide, please. The task force was included a number of representatives from the European countries, from the European member states. Each member state could propose a number of technical experts that would participate in this task force. one of whom was also myself, but also you can see Nicolas' name in there, so we're working together in this. And by the way, I think I did the same mistake that Hannah did. I didn't introduce myself. My name is Chris Kanelopoulos. I work for Zeant as a Senior Trust and Identity Manager. I'm, of course, involved in the European Open Science Cloud. I'm involved also in the ARC community, and I have been doing trust and identity for the last, I think, almost 20 years now. So, yeah, I think I know many of you already have seen in the call today. So, to continue, next slide, please, Nicolas. So, when we started the task force, as I said, a bit more than a year ago, we set the goal to deliver 4 artifacts. One was an initial document view for the first principles that the ESKI should abide to and the initial requirements, a baseline architecture, a catalog of good examples, and what does it mean to be part of this AI, the rules of participation. Next slide, please. So for the first principles, we try to take really a step back. I mean, many of us have already been involved since many years in the ARC project, in the ARC initiatives, in EDGES, but still, we said, let's take a step back at this point to revisit the whole problem, see what we want to achieve, and what should be our guiding principle in this journey. And we decided on 3 very basic principles. One is that the user experience is the first measure of success in whatever we do in the area of AI, that all trust flows from the research collaborations, the communities themselves, and that we are trying to design a system that is by nature and also like science distributed. There is no center in such a system, and that's why we're not trying to design a centralized European solution. Next slide, please. So, given that we had set up our guiding principles, of course, something that was very important for us was not to go back and reinvent the wheel. And many of the people involved in the ESKI task force were really active for many years in the context of the authentication, authorization, research for collaboration community. We have invested a lot of effort in a very wide group of technical experts, and we want to build on top of those outcomes. So the ARC blueprint architecture, with all of its extensions and guidelines, and the ongoing governance that we have managed to set up in a very international manner that goes beyond Europe within the EDGES group, should provide the starting point for the work that we will be doing in the context of the European Open Science Cloud. In particular, for the ARC blueprint architecture, as you heard just a few minutes ago from Nicolas, it builds on top of the existing best practice in the scientific community. It draws all the input from our activities with the scientific communities, with the research collaborations. It provides a clear guidance for how we can use campus identities used by universities, by higher institutions, research centers, and integrate them with the scientific groups, the scientific groups that are collaborating and going to consume this in order to make access to the resources easier and more secure. The RPBA comes with the beginnings of a governance structure in the EDGES group. I will not talk about more about this in this discussion, but if you're interested, we can follow up later offline. And the last and very important bit, it has international buy-in. As I said, the footprint, the participants in the ARC community are scattered around the whole globe, and we have really managed through the last 4 or 5 years to create a really international endeavor. Next slide, please. So you have already seen the slide from Nicolas, how the ARC blueprint architecture has evolved in a kind of fractal way. So, so on the top left, we have the very basic, the beginning of the ARC blueprint architecture, the proxy model, and then how this proxy model can start having an implementation architecture where you can see many of these architectures coming together as implementations and interacting with each other in an interoperable infrastructure. Next slide, please. So through the last few years, we have been already building solutions on top of the ARC blueprint architectures. We have managed to solve a number of problems, but still we know that there are a number of problems ahead of us. So three major problems that we had identified were the community attributes and authorization, how this can be done in a scalable manner, and also how we can ensure the proper flow of attributes, going back to exactly what Carlo said before. How to implement multi-infrastructure workflows, because users do want to be able to compose resources from different places and to be able to have one single experience in the data analysis that will end in the scientific outcome. And of course, how we can scale this? How we can scale this before, beyond a proof of concept, beyond a pilot infrastructure, something that would be truly a European, pan-European infrastructure. Next slide, please. So in terms of the community attributes authorization, it is important to understand that the basis of the ARC blueprint architecture and of also access to the European Open Source Cloud is the research collaboration. But we need to understand that the collaborations, the communities are not the only source of attributes for access control. There are many different things at play. For example, any researcher or research group might get access to specific high-profile or high-cost resources on a given high-performance computing center. How can we manage the access there? These are not necessarily based only on the aspect that somebody is a member of a given collaboration, but also possibly because of the result of a peer review that has granted a specific grant to that particular group to be able to use these resources. Attributes also may not be only user specific, but they might be specific to other contexts and therefore are not necessarily managed by the community themselves. And last but not least, we talk about community attributes, but what are they? What do they compose? How can we make sure across different communities, collaborations, infrastructures to use a common language in terms of the information that we need to share about the individual, to properly identify them, authorize them, and grant access to them to the resources. Next slide, please. Regarding the second challenge, which is the multi-infrastructure workflows, we have a simple use case that we can describe the problem at hand. Let's assume that a user wants to use a user which belongs to a community X, a research collaboration. They want to use a Jupyter Notebook service provided by an infrastructure provider. They want to use that service in order to be able to perform their computations. But then they want to be able to get the outputs of these computations and store them on another location provided by another infrastructure or by their own community, perhaps. So there is, in many cases, a split between the computational aspect, which is a transitive thing, to the storing of the data, which is something more persistent and permanent. And this might need to be performed by different infrastructures. So how can we have an authentication authorization infrastructure capability that would allow us to run something, a Jupyter Notebook job that would produce results, and then that job as an agent to be able to get those outputs and store them to another location with the permissions that the user has granted to that particular process. It might sound an easy problem, but it is actually a very difficult problem because it involves trust across several barriers, and it can become even more difficult if we start thinking that we don't have just two infrastructures that they need to pair with each other, right? This can be a very dynamic environment where we don't know beforehand, perhaps even in some cases, what the remote infrastructure where somebody wants to store something would be. Next slide, please. The last challenge was about the scalability. And RBPA 2019, as also presented by Nicholas, made a very important leap in introducing the logical separation between the community AI, where the research collaboration manages the permissions, the roles, the membership of the collaboration, and the infrastructure proxies, which are basically managing access to specific resources provided in the realm of a given infrastructure. And when we introduced that in the ARC Grouping Matrix 2019, the initial assumption at the time was that we would be having a number of community AIs that would grow quite a lot, many communities, many collaborations, but rather than the number of infrastructure proxies, those who are actually providing resources, would remain low. But this was not actually a correct assumption. I mean, through the last few years and through the initial implementations of the European Open Science Cloud, we start to realize that actually each research collaboration has, in many cases, their own infrastructure, their own data that they want and can share with other research infrastructures. So suddenly, our whole principle where we based our BPA 2019 seemed to be not really correct. And we start to realize that perhaps there are a few aspects that we need to rethink on how we can enable a large number of communities with their own community AI to connect to a large number of infrastructures in a dynamic and easy manner. And of course, when you have a number of participants, a large number of participants in such a wide infrastructure, what are the rules for being part of this trust network? How can we determine a clear set of rules so that we can make sure that we have trustworthy interaction relationships within this ecosystem? Next slide, please. So the blueprint architecture, how it looks like if you start putting some community AIs together with infrastructure proxies, is kind of start to look like a bit of spaghetti, because we have the user journeys where the user can go from try to access service provided by a given research infrastructure. They will click to authenticate. They will be part perhaps of a given collaboration, go to the community AI to authenticate. There they can select their home institution to authenticate, let's say university in France, authenticate, get the community extra attributes, access the service based on that part. But as Carlos said a few moments ago, the user journey might be also even simpler though. The user might want to access the EOS portal, for example, and in that case, they access it perhaps as an individual researcher, not as necessarily part of a given community. So they might select, when they go to EOS portal to browse for services, directly their home organization to authenticate that. So we suddenly start seeing that we might have multiple user journeys happening, multiple trust relationships between infrastructure proxy, community AIs, identity providers, which does create a very complex ecosystem. Next slide, please. So in EOS Hub was the first implementation project for the European Open Science Cloud, which is now being continued in a new project that started 3 weeks ago called EOS Future. In the context of EOS Hub, we had taken the ARC pattern, and basically what we had done is use that in order to enable the federated access and interoperability between the 4 major infrastructures in Europe. So that is Xeant with the editing solution, Indigo with the YAM solution, EUDAT with the B2 Access solution, and EGI check-in, EGI with the check-in solution. All of them using a solution for a community AI, hosting multiple communities within the multi-tenant environments, and at the same time, all of them being able to provide services to multiple communities, either using their own platforms or using platforms provided by other infrastructure providers. So we started having this 4x4 kind of matrix in terms of relationships, where we needed to ensure interoperability between each party and everybody else. Within the context of EOS Hub, we were able to achieve this. We were able to show that this is something that can work. Of course, we did find a number of issues that actually led us to come up with some solutions and also drive the work that we are doing right now in the context of USKI. But I think the initial the implementation was a success. It was proven that this actually is a solution that can work. But the question is, can it scale also? I mean, in this small scale with 4 basically platforms, yes, it works. So next slide, please. Yeah, can you continue to the next one? Sorry. Yes. So the interoperability in this layer is ensured by the adherence to the ARC blueprint architecture guidelines, right? All of the participants are members of the USKI in this scenario, but the relationship is peer-to-peer. So we ensure compatibility from each participant of the AEI from each platform to each other platform. Next slide, please. And next one, sorry. And yes, this is the remark I made, that this cannot scale beyond the handful of proxies. So can you continue the next one? So what we need and what we realized in the context of the EOSKI task force is that we need to abstract this trust relationship between the participants of the EOS authentication authorization infrastructure. We need to have a layer in between that would allow us not to have any more peer-to-peer relationship between each participant, but rather an implicit trust. An interoperability layer that would ensure that if a member, a platform joins, is part of this ecosystem, that it will interoperate with the rest of the ecosystems. Next slide, please. So we came with a notion of the EOS AI Federation. And actually, federation is something that we know very well. We have been doing federations in Europe and beyond in the context of EduGain for the last almost 10 years or more than 10 years by now. We know how they work. We know how we can scale trust. And we know also how we can use it in order to enable use cases that require explicit trust, which is perhaps the most important aspect. So the notion and the idea of a federation of the components, the participants, the members of the USKI came as one of the goals for the USKI. And basically what we said as a goal for the task force is trying to define the requirements and the needs to set up this federation. Next slide, please. So for the EOS Federation, we realized that we need a few elements. We need the EOSKI interoperability framework that is based on the ARC blueprint architecture. We need the EOSKI rules of participation, how someone becomes member of the EOSKI Federation, what are the obligations. That the EOS services need to be available through the EOS AI Federation, one place through which all the EOS AI services will be made available to be consumed, and that EOS AI services will be consuming identities through the EOS AI Federation, again, with a clear expectation of what kind of attribute release should be expected, etc. Next slide, please. So we went a little bit after doing all this exercise, and we extended a little bit the first principles that we started with. And we are now saying that the EOSKI is based on multilateral interactions and multilateral trust, and that explicit bilateral interactions are out of scope because this is something that cannot scale to our requirements. The EOSKI model honors the autonomy and integrity of all the members, participants of the EOSKI, and that does not require unbounded trust between them. And this is very important to understand basically the federation aspect, the federated access aspect of the implementation. The EOSKI enables the flow of attributes and properties that relate to the collaborations and are used to access content, services, resources. And finally, EOSKI users give scope and time-bound permissions for transfer of attributes. So when you grant access to your attribute information, a user, this is not something that should happen in perpetuity, but only for a given limited time. Next slide, please. The outcome of this work you can find on the website of the European Commission. This is a published the published study that we are describing the design, how we think the EU Sky Federation needs to be put together. It has been open for consultation since a few months right now. And now in the context of EOS Future, we're starting the work of implementing this EOS AI Federation and all of the components that go along with it. Next slide, please. So this is very briefly giving you a lot of information. I understand that about what we're doing in the context of EOS, how we're going forward, and how we're taking the ARC blueprint architecture, scaling it up to a pan-European infrastructure. And I'm happy to take any questions or comments in the last 4 minutes that we have.
Thanks very much. That was a great overview. We had a question in the chat from Janos, or Janos. I can also read it. Why do we need so many community AIs, since that makes it more simple, more complex for simple researchers?
Because there are many communities, many different collaborations with different requirements. This is not something that we put there as a design requirement. This is a fact of life. There are many different collaborations that are happening out there. Having said this, let me say something interesting. What we have been seeing in the last 2-3 years is that many of these research collaborations are coming together to set up bigger infrastructures. So in the context of the collaboration in Europe, we call them cluster research infrastructures. So for example, in life sciences, we see a mega cluster bringing together 13 distinct research infrastructures with pan-European footprint, setting up their own AI. Photon and neutron communities, again, many different communities active in the European region, they're coming together to create the PANOS infrastructure, bringing together, I think, 7 distinct research infrastructures. So a consolidation is happening, but still there are many distinct such collaborations. And that's something that it's a fact of life.
Maybe if I can just add that the reason for having all of these different AIs is to actually try and make it more usable for the users, so that they are only logging in through their own community and it's a workflow they're already used to. So yeah, the complexity of trying to get that to all work together for all the different variety of users is what Christos was mentioning.
I think, Hannah, what you say also, I think it's very important, because sometimes we think of it from the very high level view, and we do realize the complexity, but from the point of view of the researcher, typically many times they will never see anything beyond their own community, right? I mean, this is the only thing that they understand. They don't understand what EduGain is. They don't understand in many cases what federated access is. They're expecting to go to their collaboration environment and somehow identify themselves and start collaborating.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Do we have a final question? And then it's time to call it a day. Otherwise, thank you very much to all the speakers and to all of you for contributing to the quiz and for your questions. I think this is, for the assurance part, it's the start of a good discussion. And thank you very much to Nicholas and Christos for talking about the current best practices and multiple research infrastructure authentication in EOS. Great.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Enjoy the rest of the conference.
Okay, great, Hannah. So what I will need now is